by the military-industrial complex.
It could be seen to move violently forward, violently forward, violently forward.
I'm just a patsy.
Let's win there.
I have a dream.
I said this once or twice, but it bears repeating. If you like your current insurance, you will keep your current insurance.
You think about the Army and the Navy and the missions they run to protect the world, they run on SAP.
Well, you have done a really spectacular job. I guess pretty much everybody at this table is your customer, so
Exactly.
that's not so bad.
Exactly.
So I want to congratulate
Thank you, Mr. President. Thanks, you.
And we're back. Welcome back, Mrs. Heritage History.
Hi, it's been too long, so but I'm glad to be back.
Well, I just wanted to let everyone know that today we're is this part 3 of our
it was kind of intended to be part 3, but I'm going to connect it to the previous Venetian things, and then I'm going to veer sort of off course into a more modern issue, because we really only got up to the Roman Empire before, and I'm going to be talking a lot about the last 300 or 400 years instead of the Roman Empire. But I'm going to connect it with a really quick, slide that just covers 2,000 years. So,
right. But what we were talking about before the show started is that I just want to make a disclaimer, and then you're going to give me your notes on that too. Before we start, that we're going to be talking about Sephardim today, and as I do with words, I went and I looked up the word Sephardim. I looked up Pharisee, and I found out that Pharisee in Hebrew means the separated ones. And then I went and I looked up Sephardim, and I found out it's a proper noun and nobody knows where it comes from, which is interesting. So the word is most often associated with Jews, with Judaism. And for a long time, for several hundred years, I believe it was synonymous with Jews who came from the Iberian Peninsula, which we now know as Spain today. But the conceit, the thesis that Mrs. Heritage History has is that the Phoenicians who colonized Iberia are actually the Sephardim that we're talking about today. And that we wanted to make a full disclosure today that when we're talking about Sephardim Phoenicians, we're not specifically saying the Jews, Sephardic Jews. We're saying Sephardic Phoenicians who infiltrated Judaism. And that while not all Phoenicians are Sephardic, not all Sephardic are Phoenician. And in many ways, I think that Mrs. Heritage is going to make the case today that Jews writ large, if I'm using that word correctly. Am I using that word correctly? Let's just say Jews in general.
Jews in general.
Jews in general fall into the category of Ashkenazi, Eastern European, and then Mediterranean, Sephardic. And that there is a lot of overlap between the Phoenicians, whose history has largely been erased or left out, let's just say, deleted, and that of the Mediterranean Jews. So, but to be very clear, one of the things that we were talking about before the show is that, what started me down this road, this adventure, was walking by the Mellon Auditorium on January 5th, 2021, the day before the January 6th events. And I took this picture, and this is the pediment of the Mellon Auditorium, which I contend is the real seat of power in Washington, D.C. This is where the real decisions get made. And the reason that I noticed the reason that my attention was drawn to this is because my assistant at that day, Pat Moyse, who's an expert on the occult and on esoteric, he pointed up and he said, "Look, there's Baphomet." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "Look, there's a hermaphrodite up there." And so I looked up, and he said, look at that woman in the center. Does she look like a woman to you?" And upon closer inspection, it looked quite like a middle linebacker for the New York Giants with a couple of boobs strapped on. And I thought, no, that doesn't really look like any kind of woman that I know. And then he pointed out that on the pediment there was also a naked woman on the right, and there was other naked actually on the right and the left, and that she was the one in the center was the only one that had its crotch covered. And he said that's a wink. The reason, and you can talk more about this, but then later on, as I was walking down the street, about a block from the Mellon Auditorium is the National Archive, where they keep the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and they've got this statue in front of it, which is called Heritage, which I've done stories on and written articles on Substack about how this is a Phoenician child sacrifice statue that was actually sculpted on site in the 1930s in front of the National Archive building. And we don't contend that either one of these are Jewish statues. That is, the people who control the world, the people who are the secret societies and the cults that rule the world, are principally Phoenician in origin, and that they love to use the Jews in order to hide behind them. But that there's nothing about this statue that I think is inherently Jewish. I don't think that there's anything on this pediment that's inherently Jewish. And in fact, before we were starting the show, we identified that the entrances to this building have the Mask of Hercules or Malquart on one entrance. And on another entrance, there's a female figure. And we're not sure exactly who the female figures are. And I'll just share one other thing with you that I didn't talk to you about before the show. And that is that when Pat Moyse looked at these two entrances, he said, "Oh yeah, this is where the masks come off." He goes, part of the Hercules mask lore is that the mask is sitting up on top of his head. And what it essentially means is that when you walk through this door, you can take your mask off. And then he, as an aside, he said, "I bet you they've got some freaky deaky basements in this building where some really weird things happen." So with that, I'm gonna throw it to you, and then you can tell me what you think about Sephardim, Phoenicians, the Mellons, and then we can start the talk.
Well, when we were talking before, I thought one of the reasons that this was such a great example, number one, is that's probably Hercules and Astartes, which are the Phoenician gods. And we've talked to that. But also, this is the Mellon Auditorium. The Mellon family, one of the wealthiest families in the country, is not Jewish, but they're almost certainly Phoenician. I mean, and the same with things like the Cargill families. When you know what to look for to identify Phoenicians, and you realize that not all Phoenicians disguise themselves as Jews, you can clearly identify this stuff. And it's so flagrant, it's so obvious, and it's so Phoenician and not Jewish that one of the reasons I wanted to do this slide, this presentation, is because I've been saying for all of the shows we've talked about, we've done 2 shows. We've done, Phoenicians Among Us, and then the one that was sort of focusing on the Phoenician Roman Empire. And I constantly say I'm talking about Phoenicians. Phoenicians are a cult. Phoenicians overlap with Jews, but there's many Phoenicians families who are not Jewish. and there's many Jewish families who are not Phoenician. And I say this over and over, and people don't hear it. Because when I say something like it's ridiculous, what's going on in the Middle East is ridiculous to, it's really the city of London. And people will say, oh, you're letting the Jews off the hook. And the city of London is all Jews. And it's like, have you not? Okay, I want to make it clear that there's Jews and there's Phoenicians. They overlap. So this whole presentation is going to provide huge amounts of evidence that there are distinct, that there's Phoenicians, and I'm going to focus on the Sephardim, and I'm fine calling Sephardim. I mean, I'm not going to not call them Jews. Because I'm going to call them Jews, Sephardic Jews when they're impersonating Jews, and Sephardic conversos when they're impersonating Christians. So to make it really clear, but there's a couple real reasons. Okay, let's go ahead and start the slideshow, but let's just start with that. There we are. Okay, so the theme of this slideshow is again, I've been studying history, and I go way, way back to ancient times. And then I started even in the Middle Ages and even in modern times, in the 16th, 17th century, before I ever got to the 20th century, because I did it chronologically. And so what you see when you do that chronologically is that in the 15th and 16th century, there was a lot more going on with the Sephardim Jews than there were with Ashkenazi. They don't even appear. I mean, you have to dig and dig to find the Ashkenazis doing anything, having any visibility. They're way over in Eastern Europe, in Poland, part of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, and they've grouped every German-speaking Jew in with the Ashkenazi, even though there's very big differences historically between them, between Jews of the Rhine and Jews of Eastern Europe, but they call all of them Ashkenazi in order to get your eyes on the Ashkenazi Jews. Meanwhile, the Sephardim are they're the controlling Portuguese trade, controlling Dutch trade, financing to take over the city of London, intermarrying into the British the British ruling class and the British peers. They're involved in banking, in arms trade, in intelligence networks. They're behind the endless wars that started in the huge ramp up in continental wars really started in the 17th century in the 1600s when the arms, when the military slave traders and Eastern traders really kind of took over Holland. And many of those were both Sephardim Jews and Sephardim conversos working together. And that was a really big thing. And they were very, very influential in the founding of London and the East India Company. And there's numerous books that cover specifically the Sephardim. One of them, the two that are not on my website are the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. It's an excellent book. It's about the Sephardim's influence in settling all of America, all the continents, especially Latin America. And the Grandies is specifically about the history of American Sephardim, which is incredibly interesting too. So there's histories of the Sephardim that I think are really interesting. People need to focus more on, but all of the media is focusing on the Ashkenazi. The Ashkenazi are the big bad guys. The Ashkenazi, the big bad Khazarians, which is largely a complete psyop. They're all over the Wall Street. They're all over. They're associated with communism in the USSR. They're associated with Israel, even though at least 50% of the Israel population is Sephardim. And this is what everybody's telling you to look at. And especially they're telling you to look at the Khazars, which is ridiculous. Because the Khazars are, the history of the Khazars trying to make the Khazars into the big bad bugaboo is absolutely absurd, given that, number one, this cult has been practicing for call it 3,000 years, and they've been dominating trade and commerce and banking for 3,000 years. The Khazars didn't even convert to Judaism until the 10th century. And when they did, it was only the noble class. It was only the ruling class. And then the commoners were a combination of Christian Jews and Muslims and pagans. So they were never a really important part of the Ashkenazi Jews anyway. So the whole thing, it's just all completely ridiculous. So the important thing to know about the Ashkenazis is, well, actually the next slide, we will talk about it more. But this slide is to give a picture of the fact that there's many different branches of Judaism, and they have very complicated histories, and some of them go back to 1000 BC or more, and some of them go, like that would be the Israelites, go back to over 1000 BC. The Mizrahi are what are called the Middle Eastern Jews. Now that would include the Hebrews, but also the Alexandrian Jews and the Jews of North Africa, and also the Jews of, let's say, Baghdad and the Mesopotamia. Those were all what you would call the Mizrahi Jews, and they go back to the diaspora of the Mizrahi Jews, which is beyond just ancient Israel, goes back to 300 BC or so, and the even further back, because the first exile of the Jews was to Babylon. So that the Mesopotamian versions of the Mizrahi goes back to 700 BC. Then there's the Romanite, which I kind of call the Hellenistic Jews. They're basically Greek-speaking Jews. They have been very influential in the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea region since since before Christ, and the association of some segments of the Jewish population with Phoenicianism goes back to, I believe, at least 322 BC, when the Phoenicians overthrew Alexander's governor of Egypt and installed the Ptolemaic Empire. And we talked about that a lot, but I think that's when the first documented case of Phoenicians presenting themselves as Jews occurred. But it really goes back further, because there was the Jews of Samaria intermingled and intermarried with the Phoenician wives, which, of course, one of the things I've brought up numerous times is Phoenician lineage is always traced through the women, which makes them extremely hard to trace. However, when you're looking at some of these families like the Guggenheims or the Oppenheimers or whatever, you can sometimes pretty quickly get back to a suspicious probable Phoenician female marrying into the founding families of many of these dynasties that we think of. We think of the Rothschilds as a male dominated dynasty, but they actually intermarry into their own families. So did the Habsburgs. So intermarriage within your family in order to preserve the female line in your line is actually a big deal to the Phoenicians. But anyway, so that I'm getting off track. So
let me just make one note, and that is that for anybody who thinks that for most people, your religion is like a choice that you make and you stick with it. Like, most people don't change religions a lot. I know that in modern times that probably happens more often than it did in ancient times. However, the Old Testament is filled. It's like every third chapter in the Old Testament is about how the Israelites have fallen away. They've changed religions, and then they have to be brought back into line. And so the whole idea of like religion switching goes way back. It goes way back, and it's not something that people think of as kind of something that people do. But like I said, the Old Testament is filled with examples of whole groups of people who just decide that they want to switch religions. The other thing that I wanted to point out too is that a lot of people don't understand, and I know that you've got your issues with Michael Hudson, but one of the things that Michael Hudson helped me figure out is that that temples, or the religious centers of a lot of these places, were also the banks. So belief is not the only thing that's moving with religion. It's also economy is changing also.
That's very true. And in pre-Christian times, most of these cultures, like the Italians and the Greeks and everything, were pagans, but they did not worship Phoenician gods. But they had pagan temples, and they exactly what you said. The temples were built, and they were banks. They're where you'd store your valuables, and also oracles and all that sort of stuff. And they were also hubs of, we're going to talk about this a lot later, but intelligence. That means the spies would report in through the temples. So, so the pre-Christian era, the Mediterranean was almost all pagan. The Jews were not what we consider pagan. They had their own God, and this was the milieu into which Jesus was born. But anyway, but the point is, there's a lot of different. I'm spending too much time on Jews that we're not intending to talk about. What I'm going to focus mostly on is the Sephardic Jews, and historically, like the Romanite and the Italic and the Mizrahi, those go back to Hellenistic times, and they were intermingled even back then with the Phoenicians in ways that are not fully understood. And we're not going to talk about those, but I'm not saying that all the Phoenicians are Sephardic. I am saying that there has been a connection between Jews and Phoenicians since ancient times, and they have never taken over all the Jews. So all the Jews have never been Phoenicians, but they've always used the Jews whenever they needed a front that was not pagan. Okay, I
have to point out that the Rothschilds changed their name from Bauer, which means farmer in German, right, to Rothschild, which means red shield.
Mm-hmm.
And the Roman legions painted their shields red. So if you needed a shield, then you would use a Rothschild to protect yourself.
Okay. But what this map shows is that the second Phoenician video was all about how the Phoenicians actually took over the Roman Empire. So it was basically a whole 2-hour video about the Phoenician Roman Empire. And this is very, very important, because in the 4th century, when the Roman Empire went Christian, the emperors closed all the pagan temples, And all of a sudden, these temples that had been these, what you said, the centers of intelligence and the centers of banks and the centers of worship and the centers of kind of spiritual control and miracles and oracles, and all the way that they convinced people to, follow their pagan temples and manipulated people, those all either got destroyed or they became Christian, or call it Catholic. I'm just going to call it Christian for now. Temples. Okay. And the elite, basically it was the elite leaders in the throughout the Roman Empire that kind of all converted to Christianity to get along. There was obviously some very, very many sincere Christians, which is why they kind of went along with it. Everybody decided to go along with this, but not everybody who converted to Christianity was doing it sincerely. Sometimes they just said, okay, that's the new God we're going to worship now, and we're going to keep things as they're going. So the whole conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity was not 100% pure, but part of this conversion was the fact that Christianity did not allow usury. And
I just want to point out one thing too that you and I talked about on the phone the other day, and that is that when we're in school and we get taught about this, it's always about polytheism and monotheism, and they talk about the Egyptians and how there was one Egyptian pharaoh that wanted to worship the sun and get rid of all of the other gods. But if you think of all of these different temples, all of these different religions as banks, then what monotheism really represents, and this is a very modern idea that is actually ancient, is that it's a roll-up. That when you take all of these different religions and you say, oh no, there's only one God, and what you're doing is that you're rolling up all of the economy that is being managed by all of these different temples into one organization. So it's literally a roll up, like when private equity goes in and buys, all of the diaper manufacturers in the world, so that all baby diapers or all baby formula is being made by one group. Likewise, when you declare that there is only one God and you represent that God, and you start taking over all of these temples and they are all functioning as banks, then you are controlling the economy. So that was my point.
Right. So, but the important thing for Jewish history is for numerous reasons, because there was some rebellions that kind of caused the Jewish diaspora. But the important thing is these Phoenicians had already disguised themselves as Roman. They were already speaking Latin and not Phoenician. They already had taken over the commercial networks and expanded them into places where the Phoenician, beyond what the Phoenician Empire originally was. At the time of the Roman Empire, the Phoenician Empire was mainly the Mediterranean and imports from through the gates of Hercules, right? So at the time that the empire converted to Christianity, there was anybody who was a banker needed to appear as a Jew, because the Jews were the only people who were recognized by the empire to the Christian empire as being allowed to live in the empire and go freely, because they were the people of the book. But because, of course, they closed down the pagan temples and they supposedly stopped the worship of pagan gods, but not really. That's when everything went completely underground. And so a lot of the Phoenicians who could no longer be pagans became Jews instead of Christians, because they needed to do that in order to lend money. Okay, but not all of the Phoenicians needed to lend money, and many of them at that time very insincerely converted to Christianity. So from the time of the late Roman Empire, there was many good Christians, just like there was many good Jews, and they and then you had, from the very beginning, from the 4th century BC, you had Phoenicians who had adopted a Roman identity, and some of them were along the Rhinish border, which was really important because the Rhine was the border between the Roman Empire, the Rhine, and then the Main, and then the Danube was the border all the way from what is now kind of Belgium all the way to Romania. And that was the border of the Roman Empire. What's interesting to me is the Ashkenazi of Eastern Europe didn't even appear at all in Eastern Europe until about 1000 AD, and that was exactly the same time that there was a huge gold rush in Bohemia. It happened to be the exact same time that the Jews were open to Eastern Europe, was when there was a lot of gold being mined in Eastern Europe. And like I said, we already talked about the Khazars. The Khazars supposedly converted in 1900s, but they were not really important to Jewish history. And I get that right out of a book. I'll show you. I wanted to show you my book that has History of the Jews in Russia and Poland right here. Okay. And the second chapter is about the Khazars, and it explains that only the nobles, and this was written by a Jew, it's all Jewish history of the Khazars, and it pretty much says the Khazars are a big nothing burger. So, and this was, written in the 1800s. So, anyway, so, and also this is very much what another good source of information on the Khazars is Solzhenitsyn. And his last book was about the Jews in Russia. And he gives the same story, which is basically only the noble trading banking class of the Khazars converted. The main people didn't. So they're not, the Khazar commoners are not the true identity of the Ashkenazi Jews. That's complete BS. The Ashkenazi Jews speak German, and at the time of the Roman Empire, the trading cults of the Baltic Sea spoke German. And that's where the trading, and they were already pirates, they were pirates, and they were already attacking Roman settlements, the pirate wing of the trading class of the Baltic Sea, and those ultimately turned into Vikings. So anyway, so the Ashkenazi are super latecomers. Most of this history has to do with the Jews of the Roman Empire, and the Jews of most interest to us are the Sephardic Jews. And we're going to make a lot of associations between the Sephardim and Phoenicians, but we are not saying that the Sephardim are the only Phoenicians, or that all, so you have to stop thinking in one-to-one correspondence between Jews and Phoenicians, and that just has to stop, because I am, no matter how many times I say I'm talking about Phoenicians, I am not talking about Jews. People are not hearing. So I'm going to say it one more time, and I think people still are so into their it's the Jews thing that they're not hearing what I'm saying. So I'm saying it really loud this time with tons of evidence. Okay, so let's get started on the Sephardim. All the rest of this whole presentation is going to be about the Sephardim. So
right. Next slide.
Okay, next slide. Okay, the Sephardim are the Spanish Phoenicians. Okay, Sephardim were Spanish Phoenicians. Some of the Spanish Phoenicians developed Jewish identities. Unquestionably, there was some real Jews that came to live in those communities and vice versa. But when you are studying Roman history, European history, almost any history, the history of Spain is presented in a ridiculous way as backward people, as very bigoted people, as, anti-Jewish, blah, blah, blah. And it's all complete bunk. They have intentionally downplayed the importance of Spain in history because Spain was so incredibly important to the Phoenicians. And the reason it was so important to the Phoenicians is because this was where Spain, especially southern Spain, but really all parts of Spain, because there was a lot of gold in northwest Spain as well. The parts I marked in yellow are really big, important. Silver, it was tons of silver, tons of gold, tons of copper, iron, tin, mercury. Spain was an absolute center of not just silver and gold, but it was the predominant source of silver and gold for the entire ancient world. Even the Jewish shekels were Phoenician shekels. The shekel was a Phoenician gold measure. And the town, which is now called Cadiz and was formerly called Gades, was the trading center for all types of metals. In fact, it was there was traders who, including Phoenician traders, but also another group of Celtic traders called Veneti, they mined gold in Britain and brought it down to Cadiz to trade. And the Phoenicians of Spain, and again, the Phoenicians settled Spain, colonized Spain, enslaved many of the natives by at least 1000 BC. So this is as old as King David, as Tyre. The Phoenicians dominated especially southern Spain for 1,000 years before the Romans appeared. And Cadiz was one of their Gades, I'm going to call it Cadiz so that you can find it on a map. Cadiz was one of the pillars of Hercules. It was one of the fundamental, most important. There's huge amounts of Phoenician history based in Spain. A lot of it is told through legends like Hercules legends. But I'm going to have to go really quick through the history of the Phoenicians in Spain. But the point is, there's almost no record of Hebrews and the Hebrew religion being practiced by large numbers of Sephardim until about 300 or 400 BC. There's just no evidence of that. So the official story is that the Jews migrated en masse to Spain sometime between 200 and 400 BC, AD, and at the same time, all the Phoenicians that formerly lived in Spain became Roman, spoke Latin, became Christians, intermarried with the other populations, and disappeared. So the official story is that there's no more Phoenicians in Spain after 400 BC, but there's a huge influx of Hebrews or Jews. And that is obviously complete bullshit, excuse me. But any idiot can see that when you have a 1,000-year presence of Phoenicians in Spain, dominating all of the mines, metalworking, and the reasons that they dominated the mining is because there was a lot of secrets. You know how I talked about Phoenicians having a whole lot of secrets? The way to get ores from the earth and build tunnels and extract metal from ores was a huge part of alchemy. And alchemy is this part of secret society, and the other country didn't know about it. They kept their secrets secret. They kept their navigation secret. They kept their map secret. They kept their secrets of, mining and tunneling secret, and their secrets of extracting and mixing metals to the mixing of metals to bronze they shared with other people, and the metalworking they shared with other people. But in terms of getting the ores out of the ground, that was a secret that was guarded by the Phoenicians and controlled by the Phoenicians. And they basically, Spain was the silver house of Europe for over 1,000 years, including during the Roman time. I just found, when I was trying to prove this, a list on a history site of 1,400 mines, metal, gold and silver mines. It was 1,400 silver mines from ancient times. All of the historical records of them. Of those 1,400, 1,000 were in Spain. So they were overwhelmed. So this was the treasure house of Europe. It's incredibly important. It's not mysterious that that Latin America was discovered, that America was discovered by Spaniards or Iberians and developed by Iberians, and that most of it is still, associated with the Spanish language. That is not a coincidence. And as much as Spain is presented as backwards and whatever, that's complete BS, because Spain was rich. In the Muslim era, Spain was Cordoba, Spain was the largest, richest city in Europe. So let's go ahead and I'm going to whiz through 2,500 years of Sephardim in Spain. And I have to get, I need to talk about what happened after 1492. And this is huge. I have a whole course where when I started doing this presentation, I wanted to just tell this fascinating history of the Jews and Sephardim in Spain. It's everything about their history is interesting. And I started this presentation, and then I threw out the first 10 slides I did and created this one, because if I'm ever going to get to what happened after 1492, I just have to skip it. But basically, Phoenician controlled all of southern Spain for at least 800 years. And their main city was Cadiz, which was a pillar of Hercules. That we've already covered. Cadiz surrendered peacefully without a fight to the Romans. And they did this by bribery and influence. So they surrendered. They started speaking Latin. They were all the people who owned land and all the people who owned the mines and controlled trade were allowed to continue doing what they were. They became, and this was during the Second Punic War. And within 50 years, Rome had supposedly conquered Carthage. But what really happened is that the Phoenicians took over Rome. And that is what the whole second Phoenicians video is about. I think it doesn't have the word Rome in the title. It probably should have, but it's part 2 of Phoenicians Among Us. And that all that covers is the Phoenician takeover.
I will link to all of this stuff.
Yeah. So that we've already covered. Then there was a Visigoth period, and the first evidence of Jews was during the Visigoth era. And they got along perfectly well with the Arians. They didn't have any trouble with Christians until they clashed with the Catholics. And that's a long story, but we're going to skip. Moorish Spain lasted for about 500 years because the Visigoths had gone Catholics, and the Catholics were trying to restrict Jewish slavery and, other, Jewish usury. They allied with the Moors, and there was only one battle. So all of Spain got taken over with only one battle. And this opened up the golden age of Sephardic Jews, where the Sephardic Jews were the upper class. They were they were administrators, they were educated, they had libraries. There was remember how we talked about disappearing libraries? Turns out there was a disappearing, because everybody says the Moorish Spain had academies, and they had books, and they had libraries. It's all true. And guess what? They have all disappeared. There's no trace of any Moorish library anywhere. So what happens to all the Phoenician libraries? I want to know. They all tend to be destroyed and disappeared. Isn't that tragic? I don't really think that's what's happening.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not sure. When I hear that a library was destroyed, I just think somebody took all the books.
Yeah, I think so. It doesn't make sense to collect a giant library and then have it completely vaporized. But that's what happened.
At this time, knowledge, I think it was Francis Bacon who said, he didn't say knowledge is power. He said, no, I was just listening to Robert Frederick and James Delingpole talk about this. But Francis Bacon came up with the term that we have categorized as knowledge is power. And these books were more expensive than gold.
They're absolutely priceless.
Yeah, they were,
and they all disappeared.
They were more expensive than gold at the time, and so, so the idea that anybody was going to go burn them doesn't make any sense.
And they all disappeared. It wasn't like there's this, and there wasn't just one library. There was they had 5 or 6 different libraries, but they were all interconnected, like interlibrary loan type things. And all 5 of the libraries magically disappeared. Nobody knows where they are. There's it's crazy. It's one of those things that creates the Dark Ages. When all the books disappear, it kind of creates a Dark Age. So even though Cordoba was the biggest city, most prosperous city in Europe, and it had a biggest library, and it had an academy, and it was really advanced, it's all disappeared. So, anyway, so on to there was conflict between there was supposedly Christian Spains in the north of Spain, and they had conflicts with the Moors, but the conflicts didn't really start going well with the Christians until the 13th century. And at that point, within about 100 years, I can't go into all the history, they basically overran all of Spain, and Castile, which started as just kind of a
the Christians of Castile and Leon were supposedly Christian empires, and they were small empires, small kingdoms in the north of Spain. They ultimately united, and then and Aragon was also involved. It was also another one in northern Spain, but it was more the ports with all the islands. And so they united in about the 1300s and overran with a series of battles, numerous really important Muslim cities. And by about 1212, they were dominant. Christian Spain, which still hadn't combined all the kingdoms, there was still Portugal and Castile / Leon, and Aragon were sort of the main ones, but there was even some smaller ones. So they weren't united, but the Christians really had the upper hand. And then I think a little after that, they took over
Cordoba and Seville, which were the biggest, most important Muslim cities, and pushed all the Muslims who happened to get along great with the Phoenicians and lived mainly in the southern coast, which had been a Phoenician stronghold for thousands of years, and they were pushed into Granada, and the Christians took over everything. Then there was the great reign of Isabel and Ferdinand, and that's when Spain was united. But even before Isabel and Ferdinand, there was a lot of conflicts between the Christians and the Jews, the Sephardic Jews, because the Sephardic Jews were all suspected of being in alliance with the Muslims. Okay, because they lived among the Muslims and were very prosperous among the Muslims for over 500 years, according to regular timelines, which I don't really believe, but whatever. So what's important is this conflict occurred before 1492, and there was a huge the Jews got really angry at the Christians got really angry at the Jews in 1391. So that's the year of the famous pogroms. And that was caused by the sudden death of a very pro-Christian, anti-Jewish. Well, it's too complicated because the politics weren't really pro and anti-Jewish. There was Jews that were friendly to the Christians, and there was Jews that were very hostile to the Christians. And the king, or who was considered to be, his advisors were the nice Jews, got suddenly murdered. Not murdered. He had an accident. So there was a lot of suspicion, probably based in reality, that the Jews had something to do with murdering the Spanish king, or the Castilian king, and the new king was going to be his son, and his son was married to a woman who seemed more suspicious. So that was the cause of the pogroms, as the suspected assassination.
Sounds like Hamlet.
Yeah. It was very Hamlet. I can't. This is why I can't go into it. But the pogroms didn't come out of nothing. It was caused by the sudden death of King John, who was the son of Henry Trasmara, who was very pro-Christian. Anyway, so starting in 1391, there was a lot of pressure to convert to Christianity, because it was obvious that there was so much hostility between the Jews. The Christians just flat out didn't trust the Jews. And they accused them of blood libel. They accused them of human sacrifice, all this sort of stuff. And many, many Jews converted to Christianity at this time. So the total number of Sephardim or Sephardim Jews in Spain in 1300, well before or like 1350 or something, well before the pogroms, was about 500,000 roughly. You get all numbers all over the place, so you're going to find things that are roughly in between 300 and 600,000. So there was hundreds of thousands of Jews, about 10% of the total population of the Iberian Peninsula was Jews, and many were in Iberia, many were in Portugal, some were in Castile. Many of the Muslims in Granada were suspected to be Jews, or at least, that Granada was still very friendly to Jews. So the conversion of these Sephardim to Christianity goes way back, goes 100 years before 1492. Then in 1492, the Jews were expelled. And again, the reason for the expulsion was there was a very famous Infant of LaGuardia case where the Jews were accused of murdering a Christian child. There was actually, there's actually a real basis for this, and it's not all myth. Some incident happened where there was some witnesses and some confessions, and you can make of it what you will, but it inflamed the Christians again, so that Ferdinand and Isabel thought there was no way the Christians and Jews were ever going to get along, and the Christians needed to either convert, stop practicing Judaism, or leave the country. And that was the big expulsion. But
did you say that
thing that's really important?
Who had to convert?
The Jews needed to convert to Catholicism,
right,
or leave the country. Hundreds, tens of hundreds, over 100 years between 1391 and 1492, hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands of Jews converted. So the conversion didn't start in 1492. It started 1391, and even before then, many of the Sephardim had converted to Mohammedanism, okay? And others were Jews living among, so they were all different religions. And some of them were pure Phoenician, and others intermarried, because intermarrying into other races was one of the things the Phoenicians did, and had been doing for thousands of years. But the thing that's really, really important is to understand that of the total number of Jewish Sephardim in Spain, in, let's call it 1350, at least twice as many converted to Christianity as remained Jewish. So when I'm saying the Sephardim were Phoenicians, with maybe some Jews intermixed, and probably some who didn't really participate in the worst rituals, or weren't as inculcated as others, or weren't as powerful as others.
These are Phoenician rituals you're talking about.
These are Phoenician rituals, because the Phoenicians always do the rituals, because go back to when we talk about Phoenicians, it's a cult. They separate you. They want to be separated, or they want to be accepted as doing, and probably some of the original Phoenicians actually did stop doing the cult and actually did fade into the intermarry with native Iberians. But those ones didn't practice Judaism, because Judaism was a cover for you needed to have, the reason you needed a Hebrew cover is partly was the loaning monies, but partly it was because if you're going to teach Phoenician scholars to read all the hidden Phoenician texts and to pass on the Phoenician secrets, because remember, this is all secret societies and it's all controlling secrets, and those secrets are written down or communicated in Phoenician, you need a cover for why you have people studying Phoenician texts. Well, being a Hebrew scholar or a rabbi is a great cover for spending your whole life studying Phoenician texts, isn't it? So the for the real secret caste, the inner caste, who really had access to all these secrets that were hidden, they a lot of times needed a cover of being a scholar of some type. And being a Hebrew scholar was a good way to pass this on knowledge where it all looked normal, So now,
yeah, it's the classic wolf in sheep's clothing.
Yeah, exactly. So so many of these Sephardim converted to Catholicism or other Protestant religions later on, because Protestant didn't exist at this time. But this is so that the distinction between Sephardim, that is the descendants of the Spanish Phoenicians, which is what Sephardim is, and Jews got broken long before 1492. So already by 1492, before the expulsion, there were tens of thousands of Spanish Sephardim. There was thousands of Muslim Sephardims, and there was, at least 150,000 or 200,000 still Jewish Sephardim. So Sephardim is not, Sephardim, meaning Phoenicians from Spain, is not equivalent to Jews or even to Sephardic Jews. So the rest of the slide is going to be all about talking about what some of these non-Jews did, or these conversos did, or whatever you call them. So there was at least twice as many non-Jewish Sephardim as Jewish. And that, we have to understand that to understand the problem of there being many crypto-Phoenicians who are not Jewish. Okay, so let's keep going. And then, so what happened in 1492 is the Jews were forced to migrate out of Spain. So from 1492, for many years, there was effectively zero Sephardic Jews in Spain. So from that time, all of the Sephardic Jews went many other places. Okay, so this map kind of shows you visually what they're doing, and I'm going to read. I have a or we can just go to the next slide. Did you? I was going to just have you look at this picture while I read, but I kind of need the next slide to remember all the data.
All right, hang on one second, Riga.
Okay, so where did the Sephardim go? A huge number of them went to Portugal, because the Portuguese conversos, many of the Portuguese had already converted to Christianity in order to control the trading and merchant networks. And so there was already a lot of Portuguese Sephardim. And so a bunch of the Sephardim conversos went and joined the Portuguese, and together they dominated Asian trade during the 16th century. So this was the age when Portugal dominated Eastern trade. In 1580, however, the Inquisition, I didn't talk about the Inquisition, but the Inquisition made life in Spain difficult for the conversos, who were still practicing Judaism, which corresponds very, very well.
Were they actually practicing Judaism, or were they actually practicing Phoenician?
They were almost certainly. If you're, there's no reason to be a Jew in Sephardim Spain. There's no real reason to continue on with that religion. But many people did, because they were actually practicing the Phoenician religion that was disguised as Jewish stuff. So it's very complicated. The Phoenician and Hebrew stuff was quite intermixed. And like I said, not everybody did human sacrifice, but human sacrifice certainly got done. Very likely the sexual grooming of young people got done, and there's evidence of that in another book that I'll talk about later. So anyway, so that explains Portuguese. Portuguese did not have the Inquisition. It imposed it on its mainland, I think in the 1540s, but it didn't matter so much to the traders because they were based in the colonies and they were at sea most of the time. So it wasn't until 1850 that Portugal imposed the Inquisition on its colonies. And that is what made it very, very difficult for the conversos, because as long as nobody was harassing them and they weren't at risk of having their property confiscated and being accused of being Judaizers, they could be left alone. But in about 1850, definitely into the 1600s, they started fleeing to other places, the ones that were in Portugal. So Portugal stopped being a really huge center of conversos. But they fled as Portuguese. So you find Portuguese all over. You find Portuguese in Amsterdam, Portuguese in Brazil, Portuguese in Mexico. And many of the Portuguese who fled Portugal were the Sephardim. So
it seems obvious, but I'm guessing that Christopher Columbus was probably Phoenician, or
we have a slide for that.
And that was a very Phoenician kind of expedition.
Yes. So anyway, I have to just there's way too much stuff. I have to blast through this because the whole story of the Sephardim who went to the Ottoman Empire is a huge. I mean, this could be a 2-hour lecture in itself, but just to make the connections, a whole bunch of the Sephardim fled to the Ottoman Empire because it was Muslim. Now remember, the Jews got along great with the Moors and the Muslims, and they got along great. They were welcomed because they were and they were welcomed because they were rich and also because they were anti-Christian. And because the Muslims, as part of their religion, they have this tax, right? I forget what it is called. Right, but if you're super rich and have tons of hidden gold, you don't mind being taxed.
Right, but what I'm saying is that the Muslims don't really actually have a problem with people who are not Muslim as long as they pay their tax.
No, but they were at war with Christian. They were taking over Christian territory in the Balkans. Okay, and if you look at when, who financed all these wars in the Balkans against the Christians, you find that the Sephardim were, I'm just going to call them Sephardim. Well, I'm going to call them Sephardim Jews because now they were still identifying as Jews when they went to the Ottoman Empire. Some of them converted, some of them identified, the Domne or so identified as Muslims, but most of the Jews, most of the Sephardic Jews still identified as Jews, and they intermarried with the Mizrahi Jews. And so they really became an important part of the Ottoman Empire, and they financed all these wars against Christians for the next 400 years. And also the Sephardim were also financing the Habsburg wars against the Turks. So all the money for all these wars in the 1600s came from the Sephardims because they had all the money because they controlled the bank, the treasure house of Europe for 2,000 years. And so they had lots of it hidden everywhere. So they didn't keep it all in Spain. They spread it all over the place. So a lot of them went to North Africa, and this was the era of the Barbary pirates. And the Barbary pirates were funded by, and they were the fences, and there was even many Jewish pirates that were Barbary pirates. Of course, the big name ones weren't, because they always kind of, are behind the scenes. But this whole area of Barbary pirates, the Barbary pirates captured over 1 million Christian slaves during the 1500s to 1800s. And
they sold them to the Ottomans, right?
And they sold them mostly to the Ottomans, yes. And so, and they were basically sort of the Ottoman Navy because then both North Africa and Ottoman was Muslim, and they were all funded by the very, very, very wealthy Sephardim. And most of them maintained their Jewish identities, but a lot of them just kind of mingled in with the Muslims too. They also went to important centers of Jewish culture in Italy, because remember that slide before, there was very, very old Jewish communities in Italy that had and we're going to talk about this later, but the Jesuits were mostly converso Sephardim. At least they were a very, very, very influential part of them. The big one is they went to the Netherlands, especially after Portugal imposed the Inquisition. So then what you had is the 1500s, Portugal dominated Asian trade. And in the 1600s, Amsterdam dominated Asian trade. And they also, this was the golden age of Amsterdam, international finance, international trade, philosophy, printing, the rise of the Dutch East Company country. They went to the Balkans, and there was new centers in Bosnia and Bulgaria and Macedonia. So they started taking, the Sephardim started settling in the Balkans, and then a huge amount of conversos and even openly practicing Jews were all over the New World. And we have slides about that. So I think that's it. So that was what happened when they went. This is where they went. And we haven't even talked about the city of London yet, because we're going to get to that. But one of the things to notice about where the Sephardim went, and this has everything to do against this bizarre psyop against the Ashkenazi, is this is a map of the Jewish populations in 1750. Now, this is still 100 years or 200 years after the Sephardim left Spain. But a huge amount of at this point, the great growth in Jewish population was in Eastern Europe. And this is not where the Sephardim went to. The Sephardim stayed almost entirely in Roman towns that were founded in the Roman Empire. And that is because throughout history, ever since the Roman Empire was run by Phoenicians, and the biggest chunk of the Phoenicians who were running the Roman Empire was in Spain, but there was Sephardim throughout Europe, especially along the trade routes, and especially along the Rhine and the Rhone and the Maine and the Danube, which were huge internal trading routes. So there was a lot of what I call Rhenish Jews along the Rhine, and they're very old. They go back to Roman times. But there was also, that's where you get all the Jews in Vienna and Budapest, because that was the Danube. And you also get Jews in this southern Spain, southern France along the Rhone River, because those were kind of the three, but along all rivers, but those were kind of the big rivers for continental Europe. And also northern Italy, there had been Sephardim, there had been Phoenicians in northern Italy since before Roman times, because it was sort of during the Punic War, the Romans were sort of, the Carthaginians were sort of allied with the Macedonians, and there was a lot of Macedonian wars. The Macedonians kind of controlled a lot of the ports, the trading ports of northern Italy and where Venice was at the time. So anyway, they almost all settled in the former Roman empires. So the Ashkenazi really were they really were based mainly in the East, and they really didn't participate that much in these old Roman networks that were all controlled by the Sephardim and the ancient Phoenician networks along those rivers that were very much in league with each other and had been controlling trade in Western Europe for, this was in 1750, since that's basically 2,000 years since the time when the Romans took over Spain and started controlling the whole Roman Empire and all the trading routes. Okay, so they're basically, the Sephardim are associated with all of the Jews of the old Roman Empire. Not, for the purpose of tracking the Jews, because we're not tracking the Christian conversos right now, but we will. But for the purpose of tracking the Jews, they mostly settled in Jewish territories that were pre-existing from Roman times. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, I think I already, there's a whole book that covers this, Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. It's a great book. And these are just quotes, okay? The quote, one of the quotes is, the New World had an underground community of crypto Jews known only to each other and their brethren in other colonies. And what is great about the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean is they don't pretend, they consider the conversos to be Jews, okay? Now, what I'm saying is both the conversos who controlled trade and the Jews who were involved in trade were probably Phoenicians, okay, or very, what I am considering part of the Phoenician cult. And so what he does is he says, let's just not pretend that the conversos were really Christians. They were Jews. So I'm just going to talk about, when I say the Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean, I'm talking about both the Jews and the conversos who were really Jews. Okay. So he's
what's interesting to me about this is that I'm thinking back on my life. So my father was Ashkenazi and my mother was Catholic, and I look Jewish to a lot of people. And it was funny because when I was in high school or college or stuff, and people they would talk to me and they would assume that I was Jewish, and I would tell them that I was not Jewish, and they go, "Oh, come on, you're a Jew." Yeah,
they call everybody right, but
it was like a wink, wink, nod, nod. It's like, no, I'm not. I went to,
but it's very clarifying
for how bar mitzvah once. You know?
For how this book is written, he just cuts through the BS and includes the conversos as Jews. So when this is talking about the Jews dominating trade in the Americas, even Spanish America, especially Spanish America, they're really saying that they're crypto Jews. And that the Jews, and they're all, it's a cult, and they only deal with each other, and they all wink, 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 nudge, nudge, know who each other are. So this is a quote from somebody. These are quotes from the 1500s. Okay, so in the 1500s, people were saying crypto Jews known only to each other controlled trade, and they had an underground community. And this is from Lima, Peru. I don't have these quotes are all from this book. The city is thick with Jews and conversos. Everything goes through their hands, from brocade to sackcloth, diamonds to cumin seeds, precious pearls to guinea blacks. So that they were saying they controlled the trade. In Potosi, Bolivia, which was formerly one of the biggest silver mining centers in all of the Americas, and was run by was just almost mined out in about 200 years. And the quote says, the silver trade is almost exclusively in the hands of crypto Jews. In Port Jamaica was very much a center of converso and Jewish activity. The crypto Jews eat us and our children out of all trade. They purchase the entire cargo of a trading ship, divide it according to paid shares, and distribute the goods through agents in each of the colonies. So the whole book covers this beautifully. So I won't go into this anymore because there's so much else I have to cover about the conversos. But they basically controlled the Latin American trade, even the Spanish trade, the Manila galleons, the galleons everywhere. So this was all, and this explains why, in spite of Spain being incredibly wealthy in terms of minerals and South America being incredibly wealthy in terms of minerals, the Spain never got any of it. The people of Spain were just poor farmers. So the Spain was all being taken by international and distributed internationally. It was not. It was not going to Spain.
Just like today. Right?
Yeah. What's funny about this is
the United States drills more oil than any country in the world, and gas is $7 a gallon in California now.
I have to say this is a great example because I'm in North Idaho. North Idaho has the largest, for the last 100 years, it's had the largest silver mine in North America. And it's about 50 miles from where I am. And it's Shoshone County in like Kellogg or Wallace or that area. And everybody there lives in trailer parks. So in double wides. I mean, it's not at all a wealthy community. And all the money got extracted and sent to Coeur d'Alene and Boise and Spokane, and even and on from there, So they extract the wealth and they don't. Yeah, they don't. Yeah. They move on. Okay, yeah, keep going.
Simon Dixon calls it stripping assets.
Yes, but note that most of these people, not all, but most were crypto Jews or crypto Phoenicians, I should call them, not Jews, not open Jews. Okay, but people could see through them, but they were not openly practicing Judaism. They were Catholics. They were going to church. They were going to mass. They had priests. They had Jesuit. They had religious orders.
Right. So it's Phoenicians wearing multiple sheep coats.
Absolutely. And that's. But I'm not done beating everybody over the head with this stuff because I have to stop people telling me, oh, what you're saying is it's the Jews. No, I'm not saying it's the Jews. I'm saying it's the Phoenicians and the Sephardim were a very, very important segment of the Phoenicians. Okay, so was Columbus a crypto Jew? There's numerous books about this. There's one on the Heritage History website called Christopher Columbus, and I called it The Jews because I didn't want to write. This is the whole title: Christopher Columbus and the Participation of Jews in the Spanish and Portuguese Discoveries. Like I said, on the Heritage History, it's called Christopher Columbus and the Jews. This was written in like the 1800s, okay? And it makes a very strong case, as does Jewish in the Pirates. This is also covered in Jewish Pirates in the Caribbean, that Columbus has never been known to be a Jew, but he was extremely Jewish friendly, and many of his supporters and the people who financed his ship, and even many of his soldiers were conversos. So he surrounded himself with conversos. And the point I want to make, though, which goes way beyond Columbus, is I want to talk about the Canary Islands. And one of the things that kind of proved this is there's a book called Jews in the Canary Islands by Lucian Wolff. Well, Lucian Wolff was the ADL of the early 20th century. He was British, and he was all about defending the Jews and talking about, he was the one who was beating everybody up for being anti-Semitic. But he wrote a book about the Jews in the Canary Islands, which of course is what? It's the Phoenicians in the Canary Islands. But this other book that we have talked about before and you have on your library, and I find to be really fascinating, was also, I think this was written in the early 1900s or late 1800s. Did the Phoenicians discover America? And this book makes and this one is on the Heritage History Library also, because it's very old. It makes a fantastic, compelling case that the Phoenicians, it doesn't say Jews, it doesn't say conversos, did the Phoenicians discover America? Well, there's huge evidence that they did, and it's all been covered up. And in the 1900s, scholars talked about it openly, and everybody talked about it openly. And in fact, the Book of Mormon was written about this time, and it has all this. The Book of Mormon says that there was Jews in the Americas in ancient times, and the evidence they use is all the same evidence that the Phoenicians, but they call them Jews. But the scholars, but there's I can't even go into this, but I'm just saying that this is a very convincing book that the Phoenicians had been trading with Americas since for a really long time. I mean, nobody wants to put a date on it, but hundreds or 1,000 years or something like that.
Yeah, I think
some people say 2,000 years.
I think there's something called the Kensington Stone that's in.
Yes, and some people have debunked that.
Okay.
And some people have not debunked it. So I'm not
I think that the major proponent of that, who's written several books about it, is he seems to be a Freemason to me. So I wonder whether.
Well, the Kensington Stone is either one of those things that they put there and then prove it's fake, and then say, "Oh, this is all BS." But the case for the Phoenicians is based on hundreds of things, including language, religious practices, the pyramids, the architecture. It's based on many, many things, not just the Kensington Stone. But anyway, so what you have to ask is, there was 2 pillars of Hercules. Cadiz is one. Why was Lixus considered, which was the other pillar of Hercules, considered so important? What was there to export from Northern Africa? There's almost nothing there. How could Lixus be as important as Cadiz? Well, this is how, because the Phoenicians probably controlled the Canary Islands since ancient times and have probably been carrying on we've already proven that the Phoenicians had open sea navigation capability. Everybody admits that now. They just didn't use it in the Mediterranean, so it wouldn't get stolen. But they had the absolute technology of the ability to travel America. Now, if Lixus was the port by which things from the Americas got traded, then Lixus would have been a really, really important port. And that makes a ton of sense to me. Now, what makes it more sense is, where was Columbus right before he went to talk to Elizabeth and Ferdinand? One guess, Peter.
Lixus?
The Canary Islands.
Okay. Oh, that's right. Canary Islands.
He was in the Canary Islands, supposedly hobnobbing with Portuguese, because Canary Islands was supposedly run by Portuguese, but the Portuguese sailing, stuff was controlled by Phoenicians. So the Canary Islands are, because of currents and winds, the Canary Islands are a great launching point for going to the West Indies. And that is where actually when Columbus sailed, he sailed down out of Cadiz and to the Canary Islands, and he launched from the Canary Islands. And he probably had with him he probably at the Canary Islands probably picked up a navigator who would help him navigate his way to these islands that everybody all the ships in the Canary Islands already knew about, because they'd already been trading with the Americas for hundreds of years.
And because of the nature of the sailing ships at the time, which was that they used trade winds. They had these kind of giant sails that didn't take advantage of the effect that modern sailing ships wound up being able to take advantage of. And so they needed following winds. And so if you look at the wind patterns of the Atlantic, it kind of goes in a big circle, and you have to go, you need to go south in order to go west. And then when you come back, you have to go north to go east. So
yes, that's exactly right. And that's why Canary Islands are the natural launching point. And there's tons of evidence. Okay, so I think I made that point again. It's one of those things. There's too much information. I'm just trying to present all of it. Any one of these things we could talk about for an hour. Right. So let's keep going, because this is a survey of I'm doing the preponderance of evidence thing. So what's next? Okay, I think I already made this point. So I'm not going to spend more than a second on this slide, but basically first they went to Portuguese dominated. Portugal's got the Inquisition. Then they went to Amsterdam. And then under Cromwell, Cromwell allowed the Jews to return to England.
Yeah. Cromwell seems to be a crypto Phoenician.
Oh yeah. There's and we have another slide where we talk about, but I think this is there. I think the other slides we're going to talk about this. What I wanted to show here though is if you are not, I can't show this if you're just listening to the audio, but I have a picture of the East India flag. The East India flag bears a stunning resemblance to the American flag. Mm-hmm. And the red and white stripes is one of many Phoenician signals. So you see it in heraldry, you see it, but they had it on their ships. The Phoenician ships had red and white stripes. And now
I've written an article about this too, where I theorize that the red and white stripe indicates solve and coagula.
Which is
it's in alchemy. Solve is to dissolve something, and coagula is to bring something back. So red is the color of dissolution, and white is the color of recombination. And what's interesting is that it's an odd number. It's red. So it goes solve, coagula, solve, coagula, solve, coagula, and it ends on solve. And to me, the implication of that is that this world is an ongoing experiment, and that we are constantly, if you read American lore, again, you read about the Statue of Liberty or the pediment of the Mellon Auditorium or the Heritage Statue, and the stories that they tell you are basically BS. Okay. Yeah. And so what the 13 stripes, red and white, mean is that we are in an ongoing process of dissolving and reconstituting, dissolving. And
this is what the Phoenicians do.
Okay. So
they take over something, they dissolve it, they move on. And right here.
So the other symbolism.
Yes.
Hang on. In the upper left-hand corner, for people who are listening, is the Union, what we call the Union Jack, which is the crosses of the country of England and the cross of the country of Scotland put together. Okay, and the cross of England, which is at the cross of St. George, is the vertical horizontal one. It's the red and white flag, and then the other flag, who's the Scottish flag? I can't remember.
St. Andrew's cross.
St. Andrews, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think St. Andrews. So you got St. Andrews, which is crisscross applesauce like the Confederate flag, and then you've got St. Edward's cross, which is up in like a Christian crucifix. But when you put them on top of each other, this is heritage history. What do you get when you put the cross of St. Edward's on top of the cross of Scotland? You get a double cross.
Oh,
Okay.
which is what they do.
All right. So this is a completely Masonic hoodwink symbol. Okay. Of Salve Coagula and a double cross.
Right.
That's
I didn't know about the fact that this hooks to alchemy. That's new. But alchemy is like super important to these people. And I don't know that much about alchemy, so I can't speak with any reasonable knowledge. I'm just now learning a tiny bit about it, but you're going to have to find about alchemy from somebody else. But it's basically transformation. It's like I said, all the mining is all alchemy. You know, everything about mining, every step.
Here's where I can bring it all together with my epistemological warfare frame, and that is, the alchemists will tell you it's about transmuting, lead into gold, or to your point about what was going on in Spain, it's all about all of the methodology. Like, how do you get mercury out of dirt? Right? There's a methodology, that is
and we think of it in chemical terms now, but for thousands of years, people weren't focusing on atoms. They were focusing on processes. And that, anyway.
Hang on. Let me finish my thought.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were.
No, okay. The point that I was going to make is that there's another type of alchemy, okay, which is, again, a hoodwink, which is that changing what people believe, okay? Changing, okay, using language and magic tricks. My definition of magic is taking a self-evident truth and wrapping it in a mystery. So if you know how to extract mercury from dirt, okay, then you can tell people that you can put on a wizard's hat and get a wand out and wave it around and say some mumbo jumbo, and the mercury comes out of the dirt. You can call that magic. Today we call it science, right? But if you can convince people that you can pull mercury out of dirt, you can also convince them of other things. And that's what I call sorcery, right?
That's sorcery, and that is why they keep all these secrets. And they kept, now they've kind of let the cat out of the bag in certain ways. But anyway, we better keep going because I still have more evidence that the conversos are up to no good.
Yeah.
Remember, this is mostly conversos, not Jews. That the Portuguese were supposedly Christians.
So these are Sephardic Christians.
Yeah. Yeah. And here they're Sephardic Protestants. Okay, they're Sephardic Protestants because the who funded the 30 Years War, same guys, right? The 1600s is when all these huge wars started. They were all, anyway, I have a whole slide on war funding. So let's just keep going and see what we have.
Okay. You want next slide?
Yep, next slide.
Here we go.
Slave trade, okay? So again, it was mostly conversos. Yes, there was some very prominent Jews involved. No question about it. And if you look at where almost all the major slave ports were, almost all of the major slave ports in the New World and the slave trades that financed things in Europe were very much associated with Jews. But the 90% of these slave traders were conversos, very, very much associated. But they weren't all Jews. They were but that were very, very much Sephardim. So anyway, I'm going to move on because we have a lot more to cover. But I think the slave trade was very, very important, and it was part of the overall trade that was thing. Oh. And this is where what I call the war provision intelligence networks. So there was a huge increase in continental wars in the 1600s and 1700s. before then, you had like the 100 Years' War. You had very small, confined wars where it was just two kingdoms battling each other with their own resources until one of them gave out. Once the 1600s happened, you started these networks that were run by both Jews and conversos, because wherever the Jews could openly be Jewish, they would be Jewish. And that, again, is always because they want, you to hate on the Jews and whatever. And also, until about this time, the Protestants allowed usury in a way that the Catholics supposedly only kind of got it, stopped. So once you had a Protestant outlet, then you started to have Protestant Sephardim. And and it was all, banking and everything like that. But it wasn't just the banking and the finance, because to provision standing armies, the old way of fighting a war was to just have your knights and your infantrymen, take over somebody's town and slaughter all their pigs and take all their grain. Now you had provisioned armies and you had standing armies, and they needed provisions and they needed weapons. And you were starting to have cannons and guns and things other than bows and arrows. And you needed to have food for them and all this stuff. And the provisioners of all these wars trace back to these converso and Sephardim networks, not just Jews, but also
gunpowder was the ultimate alchemy, right?
I think they say gunpowder was not really adopted until the 1300s or something. I think the Phoenicians had gunpowder way back in the ancient times. I think that's how
they call it Greek fire. Is that what they
call it? No, there's Greek fire was a different version, but how were they controlled all the mines? And how do you really blow up rock without gunpowder or nitro or whatever? And
I think the Nobel Committee might take issue.
Well, they have these because I asked Google, I said, how did these Phoenicians dig down so deep into the mines? And they said, they lit fires to warm up the rock, and then they splashed cold water over it, and that split the rocks. I'm like, no, they didn't light fires. They had a substance involving sulfur that blew up, but I don't know what it was. Anyway, so alchemy. It was alchemy. Okay, so I think they've had explosives all along. Okay, so these are just okay. So the guy who provisioned Cromwell's army and provided intelligence, and supposedly the city of London and supposedly the city of London financed Cromwell's army, but this guy Cavargel provided intelligence and he provisioned it. He had Cromwell had a new model army, and that was what made him famous. It was a standing army, and it was all professionally organized, and it was this Carvel guy who did it for him. And he was I can't remember whether he's Jewish or
Isn't there a big American company called Cargill?
Cargill does it exactly. Cargill is the new provisioners for both World War I and World War II, and they're undoubted. Like if you study them, they're 100% Phoenician. Oh my gosh, they're so Phoenician, it's ridiculous. And they're not Jewish. They're not Jewish. Ha ha ha. Right. Okay. So so he provisioned Cromwell. Solomon de Medina did the exact same thing for William III when he took over Britain. And both of them were not just provisioning, but they had the whole intelligent networks. They managed the intelligence networks. Francini Lopez Suazu was, again, all these guys go from being conversos in Portugal, and then they go to, once they can come out of the closet, they become Jews again. So they're just Sephardim and Phoenicians. They're not, I don't know whether to call them Jewish or not. If they're, they're not. It's all fake.
It's like calling a basketball player
in
the NBA that he's only a Laker. Okay.
Yeah.
There's some basketball players that were only Lakers, but I was looking at Shaquille O'Neal the other day, and like he played for like 5 teams, right?
So Francisco Lopez Suazo was a very, very prominent Jew, but his father was a converso who got all of his wealth managing silver trade for the King of Spain and provisioning the King of Spain's army. So, it's all financing. But this guy, that's how his father got rich, was being a provisioner. And then he loaned all this money to William III for his invasion. Okay. And then the other guy I'm just going to mention, because I thought it was interesting to me, maybe not to nobody else, is Fernandez was not a provisioner, but he was a royal physician, and he was a spy, and he was a converso, and his children. Okay, what I was researching when I found this is I wanted to know what happened to all these fortunes. The Carvajal fortune was huge. The Suaza fortune was huge. The Medina fortune was huge. All of these were gigantic, incredibly important, incredibly wealthy Jewish slash converso war financiers of the 1600s. What happened to all their money? Why isn't every single one of these gigantic Jewish slash Sephardim, I'm just going to call them Sephardim fortunes, completely disappears off the face of the earth. It goes away. It is either distributed or given to charity, or it just vaporizes. So these families that are traced through the male line can become incredibly wealthy in 1 or 2 or 3 generations, and then it all goes away. They're not allowed to continue to be predominant because they don't, so the Suazo fortune just got dissipated, and there's no famous Lopez Suazos anymore. Medina and Mendez both had single children that married, and they had a whole bunch of children, but they all became Catholic. They all became Christians or Anglicans and married into British royalty, or excuse me, British nobility. Okay. So the Medina Mendez fortunes all are they're all Christian Anglican British nobles now, even though they were proud Jews.
And we're not in it.
Yeah. And the Carvajal fortune, nobody really knows what happened to it. He had 2 sons. The 2 sons didn't have any kids. Fortune's gone. Okay. So it's in, making yourself disappear is a theme of the conversos and the Sephardim.
It's a form of magic, right? You take the elephant on the stage and you make it disappear. Right. You take a self-evident truth, that the money is associated with a particular family, and then you wrap it in a mystery, which is you move it through the matrilinear line. The names change, right? The people change their names all the time.
Yeah.
It's the changing.
Change your name, change your religion. It's the reason we don't see the Sephardim dominating everything is because they go undercover again and again.
Well, what's really super, I'm having an epiphany right now.
Okay, go ahead.
And the epiphany that I'm having is I'm writing this book right now, Reframing Reality. I finished chapter 22 yesterday. I got 27 chapters, so I got 5 to go.
Yeah.
But one of the conceits of my book is that there's a bunch of words in Greek that are action words that indicate personal agency, that in the translation from Greek, which is a very thinking oriented language, to Latin, and then to the following languages, English, French, Spanish, German, whatever you want, that a lot of these words that convey individual agency, working out a problem by thinking about it, it gets nominalized. Verbs get turned into nouns. Verbs get named. And it is in the controlling of the names, which curiously was like what Adam was given by God to do. Wasn't Adam's job in the Garden of Eden to give things names, to give all the creatures of the earth names, right? So giving things names, it turns out, in the way that human beings think and believe things, winds up having a tremendous amount of power. And likewise, changing the names of things winds up having a tremendous amount of power. That's
and we're gonna see that. We're gonna see that. Right. We have 3 more slides to go, and I want to. Right. I was trying to keep it under 2 hours, but we're just gonna blast through this. This is super interesting, and I'm afraid I'm gonna have to spend a little time on it. The Jesuit order was
take the time that you need. I know that your husband wants you for something, though.
Okay. So, but anyway, the Jesuits were conversos, not Jews. They were conversos. They were Sephardim. And I'm listing here some very important Jesuits. Diego Lainez was a second superior general. He was the papal theologian at Trent. Jerome Nadel was a huge Hebrew scholar. Even though he happened to be supposedly Christian, he knew he was a brilliant Hebrew scholar, and he traveled all over Europe, visiting and sort of enforcing and recruiting conversos throughout Europe and raising tons of money. He was very important. A whole bunch. I'm not going to name some of these others because I want to get to Juan Alfonso de Blanco. Juan Alfonso de Blanco is super, super important. I can't tell you how important he is. He is not even considered one of the 7 founding Jesuits. So this is the 7 founding Jesuits. The Jesuit logo is horrendously Phoenician. We've talked about it before. It's just as Phoenician as can be. Go back to another thing to talk about that one. But what's really interesting about him is he was the secretary of Ignatius. He is the one who wrote all of Ignatius's correspondence.
Ignatius Loyola.
Ignatius Loyola, who's all focuses on Ignatius Loyola, Saint Ignatius. He was a brilliant founder. Everybody's looking at Ignatius. Alfonso was his right-hand man and the actual person who did all the writing. Okay. And he's also served as the secretary under Lainez and Borgia. And he was also with Ignatius when he died suddenly, which I think is interesting. He was the true mastermind of the whole Phoenician Jesuit geopolitical order because they had an absolute plan. And what I think is, there's 2 things that are
so he was the Edward Mandel House of the Jesuits.
Correcto. Absolutely. Wilson was there, but he was the Edward Mandel House. But go back 100 years before his time. His great uncle something or other, great uncle, was Solomon Halavi, who was the most powerful, wealthiest rabbi in Castile. He converted to Christianity at the time of the pogroms and spent his entire career trying to convince people to become Christians. And there was other saints involved too. So he ultimately became the Bishop of Burgos, and his whole life was dedicated to getting Jews to convert to Christianity. And he was and he continued to be able to have all of his wealth and all of his power. And it was a scion of that family, one of the most wealthiest, powerful converso families in Spain, who Juan Alfonso Blanco was involved with. So he was a scion of one of the most suspicious imaginable conversos in all of Spain. I think there's probably some conversos who just converted and faded into the woodwork. And the other thing is, he was always a secretary. He feigned humility in a ridiculous way. He didn't write about himself. He talked how wonderful, oh, Ignatius is so wonderful. I'm so humble. I'm so unworthy to be his secretary, right? He was running the damn thing. I think he was the mastermind of everything. He controlled the Jesuit order for like 45 years or something like that. And the person who finally, he served under 3 different superior generals, and the person who finally followed him was also a converso. When they talk about the Black Pope being the head of the Jesuit order, I don't believe it. I think the Black Pope is the secretary of the Jesuit order and always has been. And I think the whole word secretary is very suspicious.
Yeah, it's secret. It's the secretary.
I think that the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Treasurer are very, those are
right.
and the Home Secretary. These are very, very important positions. When you go to the Masons or the Rotarians or everything, I think the secretaries are super important, starting with Juan Alfonso Polanco. So when you're searching for Phoenicians, go to the secretary. Now, who was the Secretary of State of Britain for most of the 19th century? I think you know him.
Palmerston.
Right. And he was the head Mason. The secretaries are very, very important. The Secretary of States control all the elections in the United States, and they're all corrupt. So I know that for a fact. Okay, right. Let's keep going. We're almost done, guys. We're going to go over 2 minutes, but we'll blast through the last 2.
Well, we had a 3-minute intro, so you're still on track.
Okay. So I'm just circling these because I want to remind people what we already talked about. We saw something like this. The Sephardic Jews in the 18. Now what we're talking about here is migration to the United States. Okay. Most of the Sephardic Jews who migrated to the United States between 1643 and 1850 were Sephardim. So they absolutely dominated American Jews for 200 years. And it was Amsterdam and France and London. That is where they all came from. The next wave of Jews were German Jews. And they came from Germany, and that wave was between 1840 and 1880. And almost all the famous banking Jews are from they call them Ashkenazi, and they say that they're in charge of the banks and they run everything and they have all the power. They're the German Jews. And they conflate them with the Eastern European Jews. What they are trying to do with exactly what you say, making words mean something different from what they mean, is they take all of these bankers who are mostly all Jewish families from either Bavaria or Frankfurt, both of which were in the Roman Empire, and they call them Ashkenazi instead of Rhenish Jews, even though they have a completely different history. And then they import millions of these Ashkenazi, and then they call all of this Ashkenazi, so that you won't see that the banking families are actually all from a very small number, very specific parts of Germany. They're not, the banking families are not coming from Warsaw. They're not coming from Lviv. They're not coming from Moscow. They're not coming from any of these places. They're almost all coming from Bavaria and Frankfurt. So, and so that was the wave of the 1840s to the 1880s. And that's when they really started. That was when they started pushing the German Jews that they could call Ashkenazi to the front and center. So the Sephardic Jews were actually running everything before that. They needed a front. So they brought in the German Jews who were their buddies because they're all part of the old Roman network of equestrians. And then once they were settled in 1880, then they imported huge numbers of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, almost none of which are rich and famous, an incredibly small portion of them. They're mostly regular people. There's a few, but this is, and so what you're seeing is an intention of making you think that these Ashkenazi Jews in the millions are big, scary people. And the real problem is the Sephardim and their buddies, German-speaking friends from along the Rhine and Danube River. And so it's all thing. Now I'm going to, in the next slide.
This is kind of the classic scapegoat technique, though. I mean,
classic scapegoat. I also want to point out.
People don't understand that there's two goats involved in scapegoating.
Yes.
There's the goat that gets killed, okay, as a sacrifice to absolve the community of their sins. And then there is the goat that is released into the wilderness.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And,
yes.
Okay. So
released into the wilderness. Yes.
So here you have two goats.
Yes.
Right.
And almost all the Jews that were killed in were from Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
In the thing, even the Rhinish Jews had most of them all escaped. They mostly all escaped. They had plenty of warning. They had plenty of money, and they got the hell out. So these are your scapegoats. These are your scapegoats. The Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe are your scapegoats. I'm going to go to the one more slide, two more slides. Okay, and what's really funny is this is a list. If I said, okay, AI, I want you to tell me the most famous 50 wealthy banking and trading Jews in the United States, only 19th and 20th century, no 21st century, no 17th century, and organize them by whether they're German, whether they're from Eastern Europe, or whether they're Sephardic. Okay. So almost all the Rhenish Jews you see, which are what I'm calling the German Jews, I should have just called them German Jews, are from, are well-known names: Warburg, Oppenhauer, Schiff, Guggenheim, Lieber, Loeb, Seligman, Goldman Sachs. These are the big bugaboo names. They're almost all the big banking names, and they're almost all Jewish. The Sephardic Jews are not very recognizable. I couldn't believe they did this. But the AI. Now, if I ask this question,
let's call it a large language. Let's call it a large language model.
Yeah, okay.
I don't like the term artificial intelligence. I don't think.
What's really frustrating about using the AI, but I felt like I had to do this because I wanted somebody besides me to pick these people out, so it wouldn't be cherry picked. If you ask them 3 different times a question with like one word different, they give you completely different lists.
That's
but
right.
But one of the times they listed the Rothschild as a Sephardic Jew. And I said, what? Because the Rothschilds are notoriously Ashkenazi, right? And I asked, I said, what are you doing, AI or whoever you are? Why did you call the Rothschilds Sephardic? Listen to this answer. I'm going to read it. Well, the Rothschilds are Ashkenazi German by geographic origin. Their earliest ancestors adopted naming traditions and moved through trade routes that closely mirrored Sephardic mercantile networks. More importantly, in 19th century England, the British branch of the family integrated into the elite Sephardic communal structure of London, including the Bevis Mark Synagogue, bridging the gap between their German roots and the Sephardic social dominance of London.
Right. So I think that you're probably right, but I just want to point out to our audience that this is exactly why I don't trust large language models. Okay. I think it's probably correct, but the way that I would choose to do this is that I have a collection of thousands of PDFs that I've organized into something called a RAG.
Right.
And what I would do is I would ask the same question of my books instead of asking, because the problem with large language models is that you're completely dependent upon what their training material is.
Right. But I just wanted to make the broad point. I knew that you can't be exact about this.
I would guess that this is probably 99% correct, and that there's one name in there that is wrong. And if it is wrong, then that will be the name that people will pick in order to go after you. So
okay. You can do this yourself. You can do this yourself. The point here is that that there's very, very few famous Sephardim. And I think one of the things I said is, okay, if they're not, because most of these Mendez da Costa levies are not Pinto. These guys are what they're listing as the most important Sephardic banking families.
Well, I look at things like Montefiore, and Montefiore in Italian means flower mountain, which in German is Bloomberg.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Montague Norman was the head of the Bank of England, and there's a Montague family up there. And I assume because of the way that matriarchal naming goes, that he's named Montague because the mother's line of his family are Montagues.
Okay, but it's clear that the Jewish I'm not even have time. I have so much evidence of this. We're going to need 3 hours to go over all my evidence. But there's oh boy. Here's another thing. There's a book because we really have to wrap this up, and we're not covering I'm not getting to all the evidence.
I'll shut up. You go.
Okay. So there's a book called The Grandees. Okay. It's by Stephen Birmingham. Okay. And it's all about the Sephardic Jews of America. And I really wish, I really wish I had time to go into this. But one of the things that he does is he talks about the American Jews who are really who actually, okay, his first chapter is about this book called the Sephardic Jews of America or something like that. And it cuts off at 1840. So he only traces the Jewish families up to 1840 because that's when the huge influx of German Jews happened, was 1840. So there was 25,000. He traced from the original Jews, 25,000 people who descended from the original Jewish families. And among those families, almost all who were infiltrated, whatever, from the maternal line are the Rockefellers, the Livingstons, the Ingersolls, the Lodges, the Tiffany's, the Vanderbilts, the Van Renslayers, and the Hopkins. All of those non-Jewish incredibly wealthy families, mostly from the New York area, have at least one, sometimes multiple Jewish ancestors, almost always from the maternal line. Often, often before they became very wealthy. Okay. So the Sephardim in America are downsizing themselves. He also says, I think I want to quote him that if I can find the book. Okay. The Sephardim left in the United States, they live lives of wealth, exclusivity, privacy, a privacy so deep and so complete that few people remember that they still exist, which is just what the Sephardim prefer. For the Sephardim have by nature been shy, reticent, and the opposite of showy.
So this reminds me of Robert Frederick's show, the name of his show. He named his show for Francis Bacon's favorite slogan, his slogan of his life, which is "The hidden life is best."
Yes, that's exactly what the Sephardim think. And I have the same, there's another book, which I won't read from, but it does the exact same thing the Grandees does for the United States with all the royal the noble families of Britain. So they actually,
I may have this book. What's the name of it?
Oh gosh, hold on. There's a book that, okay, where did I put it? Here it is. The Tales of the British Aristocracy, the Anglo-Jewish Peerage. Okay. And
the Tales of the British Aristocracy.
Yes, there it is. It is by L.G. Pine. Okay. And somebody sent that to me to the person who was sent that to me was trying to prove that I'm calling people Phoenicians, but they're all Jewish because they all, I said the city of London's a problem. He says, yeah, but the city of London's all Jewish. And then he sends me this information that I already kind of knew because I've seen it in other books, but this just lists all of them.
Isn't that fun when somebody sends you a resource that they haven't
read? Yeah. And they're trying to prove that they're all Jews. And I'm saying, no, they're all Phoenicians. And he says, no, look, the Jews married into all the British royal families. It's like, well, they were all Sephardim, meaning they were Phoenician to begin with. And they threw off their Jewish thing in order to marry almost all on the maternal side into the Jewish families. And they've been doing this for centuries.
So I just looked at Stephen Birmingham up. That book is part of a trilogy.
Oh my gosh, I don't know, but I hadn't read this book.
He's got 3 books: The Grandees, Our Crowd, and The Rest of Us.
Oh yeah. That's Birmingham. I have Our Crowd. I thought you were talking about Tales of the British Aristocracy.
No, I was talking about Birmingham. Yeah.
No, yeah. Birmingham's an interesting.
Yeah, I have a bunch of books now that I have to add on to the Duke Report.
Now, Birmingham is very pro-Jewish, and he does all about, oh my God, we suffered so much in the Inquisition, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'm just ignoring that. You can listen, if you want to hear about how horrible the Inquisition was, you can listen to Birmingham. But we're not
arguing that the Inquisition was not horrible.
No, actually, the Inquisition is grossly overstated. A very small percentage over I think 300 years, only 3,000 out of over 150,000 people who were tried were actually killed. The great majority of the people who were tried by the Inquisition were either let off or fined or whatever. I mean, the Spanish, the Jews didn't like it. They didn't want there to be an Inquisition, but they've greatly overstated the actual amount of, the actual amount of people who were not acquitted, because the Inquisition also acquitted tons of people. The Jesuits, the original Jesuits, were accused by the Inquisition, and they were let go. And so obviously anybody this wealthy and powerful would probably have a lot of control over whoever the judges of the Inquisition were. It was probably for show, so that it would, you had all these people complaining about these horrible Jews, so the church had to do something. So they did this Inquisition.
Like the ADL hiring anti-Semitic terrorists?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, clearly the Inquisition got the Jews to move, but I think they were more concerned about being having their wealth confiscated than being killed. And because way more people's wealth was confiscated than were killed. Okay, so finally, I'm just going to wrap up with this last slide. And oh my gosh, I forgot about this. I'm just going to recommend the Ford's International Jew series. There's an article called "How Jews Conceal Their Strength." If this doesn't
get us banned, nothing will.
Yeah. So it's a very well written history. Very well. It is not hysterically anti-Jewish. It explains historically what everything is well documented. I was very interested. I read all 4 volumes. I was absolutely fascinated with it. It talks about the sports industry. That I don't see how you could understand American history without reading these books. These are really good books. And if you're going to, arrest me for recommending it.
Super interesting. I have not read these. I have them, but I haven't read them.
I've read them. They're very well written and they're very well documented.
Now I'm going to go read it, because
they don't make any claims that aren't
I read the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion too, and it didn't. Horns didn't sprout out of my head. But what's interesting to me about this is, again, there's a very successful couple of Canadians, that talk about these books as a plot by British intelligence in order to get Henry Ford to basically reduce his own signature by appearing a fool. And so that they fed this stuff to Henry Ford, and this was an attempt by British intelligence in order to take Henry Ford down. That's the conceit that I understand.
I think they're well written and very, very well documented. The author doesn't make claims that aren't documented. He reads things from the newspapers, from the congressional record. And he isn't super. I mean, he explains right away. He says he's talking about he says exactly the point I'm making, which is there's millions of Jews in the United States, and there's a small number of them which are controlling everything, and and this is written in 1920, and this is the importing of Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe started in 1880 and went for 40 years. And this was towards the end of the
ostensibly to be used as slaves and scapegoats.
Yes.
Yeah.
They imported to, well, also they knew that they were going to, do they were already planning the Holocaust to make Jews appear to be the victim, and they
needed to victimize them in order to sell.
And they also needed to get them out of Eastern Europe so that they could go look. In 1900 there was 6 million Jews over here, and now they're all gone. Right? They needed to move them, so it served a lot of purposes to move all the Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe, to flood the Jew visibility here, and to prop up as many as you could in high visibility villain type, put them in charge of liquors or something like that. But really, it was the Sephardim and the Rhenish Jews that were controlling everything. It wasn't the Eastern European ones. The Eastern Europeans one had relatively almost no influence, especially percentage wise. So what his point of view is, look, there's a huge flood of Jews and the Jews are taking over all of this. And there's like an assembly line where they're being met and they're being given money and they're being jobs and they're being moved around the United States. What the hell is going on here? And it's very important history. I'm not going to back off from it. I mean, I'm saying that these Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe are not the international Jews he's talking about. The international Jews he's talking about are the Sephardim, and I'm naming them. And if somebody wants to yell at me, I don't care.
And it's your contention that they're crypto Jews, that they claim to be Jews.
I think the Sephardim are both Sephardic Jews. I mean, for most of history, they were Sephardim Jews. And then they started converting to Christianity and they started infiltrating everything. And now they're disappearing themselves and they're disappearing their fortunes. It's not really disappearing. They're moving their fortunes to foundations and they're hiding it and they're turning into corporations and they're making it so you can't target them and you can't see them. But I see them. Okay. Oh my gosh. I forgot I have all this material. Oh my gosh. So yes, the Sephardic assimilation and vanishing dynasties. I am just going to read these things. I'm
just letting you know there's two more slides. There's this one and then there's one more slide.
Okay.
And again, I'm okay with you going. I'm not. So it's your husband I'm worried about.
No, he'll oh gosh. Okay. I have to get out of here in about 10 minutes. So that's all okay, it won't go longer than that. Okay. But I already knew that the Jews were connected to the Huguenots because of all sorts of things. And they were very involved in financing the Protestant Revolution. If you look at where the Jews in France were very close proximity to the Huguenot base of power. So there's too much to go into it. So I'm just putting this up here. Some conversos married into the European merchant class, and they appear as Dutch, Portuguese, British, or French Huguenots. But this is the brilliant thing that I found that really kind of blew me away here, because I wasn't expecting this. This is DNA studies. So there was a DNA study of the French Acadians. And
do you know DNA studies in Israel are illegal?
Okay, but this is in America, and this isn't on Jews. They were doing DNA studies on the French Acadians who then moved to New Orleans, right? And they found out that the French Acadians, that colony was largely Sephardic Jew. They call them Sephardic Jews, but I'm just going to call them Sephardim. So the Acadians from France were Sephardim. And I didn't know about this. I knew that the Plymouth Colony and the Roanoke Colony were both financed by the City of London, and that they handpicked their colonists. But I didn't know that the DNA studies done on the descendants of the Plymouth Colony settlers and the Roanoke Colony settlers claim that they were of Sephardic Jewish origin.
Well, that's interesting, because I have a friend who is a Rockefeller. He passed away about...
The Rockefellers, I already mentioned, didn't I?
And he claimed...
The Rockefellers are connected to the original Sephardic American Jews.
Right.
So the Rockefeller family, were Sephardim. The Rockefellers were Sephardim.
Well, I want to agree with you. So
okay, and
hang on.
Yeah.
What my friend told me was that his family was he said, I have Jews in my family, and he claimed to be a Rockefeller, and he also claimed that his family was on the Mayflower. So, okay, but I'm not sure that again, going back generations, it could be one part of his family from here and one part of his family from there. Like,
Right.
Be,
so,
yeah.
but he probably is Sephardim. And again, probably not every person who descended from any Sephardim is evil, but the whole, the Sephardic, these guys are evil. The ones who come through the city of London. So anyway, I wasn't expecting to find that proof, but I knew that the people who were sent by these City of London people were controlled, and they were sent in order to be the first people in America in order to, get the best land for themselves. That's exactly like I just studied the history of Idaho. Idaho was founded almost entirely by Freemasons. As soon as it became a territory, they sent from all over the, country, a whole Masons came. They were all Masons grabbing up the best, the best land, the best cities, starting all the merchant stuff. That's what they do, is they send their people to colonize things. That's right. What they've always done. This is what the Phoenicians do, the Sephardim do. Okay. So, and what they've done is they disappear into the woodwork. We think we're seeing the pilgrims, and we're seeing the people who were put there by the City of London Sephardim network to claim everything. And it isn't just Jews at all. The Acadians were not Jews. The Plymouth colonists were not Jews. None of these were Jews, but they're all Sephardim. Okay, so let's go. So they hide themselves, and they've been doing this. So the last thing I'm saying is, where are the conversos? This is my opinion. I'm listing, most Sephardim don't identify as Jewish, but they do exist, and they are behind the secret societies. They're of all creeds and races. I think the real power is knowledge. Knowledge is power. Okay. And that's what the Sephardim have been saying forever. Who has all the knowledge? It's the people who are spying on everything we do and say. The Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department, the doulas are huge because they control both the State Department and the Central Intelligence Agency. But this is where we're going to be looking for the Sephardim, and we have to look beyond the Jews. We can't be blinded by this idea that the Jews are the problem. It's the Sephardim who run the State Department and our secretaries of state. It's the Sephardim who run State Street. It's the Sephardim who run the Rockefeller Foundation. It's the Sephardim who run the Central Agency and all the intelligence agencies. It's the Pentagon. It's Skull and Bones. It's the Freemasons and all the fraternal orders. Who am I forgetting? This lists all the places you need to look for the Sephardim. And this is where they're going to be found, and they're going to be surrounded by unsuspecting people who have no idea that they're working for a demonic cult. So call me anti-Semitic. You can call me anti-Semitic if you want. The reason you can call me anti-Semitic is because Phoenicians are Semitic, and the Sephardim are Semitic, and I am anti-Phoenician. And I am anti-Sephardim. And I have no issue with Jews. No issue at all with Jews. The word that they should be using, if they really wanted to talk about Jew hatred, is Jew hatred, because that was the word that was used until the word anti-Semitic was invented in the 1880s, just at the time that they were throwing all these Ashkenazi Jews who had nothing to do with anything in front of everybody. That's all part of the plan. Okay, so we've gone way over, but I think we're still under an hour. I don't think we're under anything. Anyway, we're way too long.
2 hours and 27 minutes or something. So
okay, so this has been really great.
Where can people find out more about this? I will when we put the video up, I will list all the books. I will do it.
I will list. Okay, I'll tell you the books. There's a lot of great books about this. Some are on my website, some aren't. I will send you a list of
Okay.
books, and I will, with the ones that are on my website, I will provide links to, and I can do this within about half an hour or maybe by later today. Okay. So when this comes out, there's going to be links of books that you can read about this, and good luck. And I've only covered, this is super superficial. You can go deep down into any of those, and it's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely.
Well, this is Heritage History. I think you've done a great job.
Okay.
Thank you for all of this great work that you've done.
I hope this gives the ADL people ulcers. I hope they don't know what to do with this information.
Whatever. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Anyway, if you want to support the Duke Report, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/the Duke Report. You can buy me a coffee, or you can go to thedukereport.com, which will redirect you to thedukereport.substack.com, where you can become a paid subscriber. All of the content on the Duke Report is free. However, in order to keep doing this, people out there in the world who understand the value that I'm trying to deliver become paid subscribers, and that's absolutely the best way that you can become a supporter of the Duke Report, is to become a paid subscriber. It costs money to keep the lights on and to keep doing this stuff. I am working on my book, Reframing Reality, which I hope to have out by Christmas. And in any case, thank you, Mrs. Heritage History, for coming today and providing all of this context, because I think, there are a lot of people out there in the world. I can think of people like Stu Peters or Candace Owens or E. Michael Jones, who think that they've got it figured out. They think that they understand exactly, who the baddies are, who are in control of the world. And I think that, they get right up to the edge. And then they don't actually understand that there's yet another curtain behind.
Or they do understand perfectly, and they don't ever say the P word. The PH word.
I can't see into the hearts of other people. So I'm going to choose the Christian path and give them the benefit of the doubt. But they could be baddies. I don't know. Who knows? In any case, thank you so much. And I will stop the recording now.
Okay. It was great being here.